The Shifter's Harem, a reverse Harem Werewolf Shifter romance book. Chapter 1. The Fallen Princess. The acrid scent of burning flesh curled into Seline's lungs as she knelt in the mud, wrists bound behind her back, her once pristine battle leathers torn and soaked in the blood of her fallen kin. The fires still raged around the ruined remnants of Lunacrest's stronghold, the wooden gates splintered into jagged ruins, smoke curling toward the sky in thick, mournful plumes. The distant howls of dying warriors echoed across the battlefield, each one a knife twisting deeper into her soul. Her heart pounded, but she kept her expression carefully blank, her silver eyes cold and unyielding, despite the pain knifing through her ribs with each breath. "Bow," a voice commanded, deep and merciless. Seline lifted her chin, her defiance sharp as the dagger they had stripped from her waist. Alpha Darius Voss stood before her, tall and menacing, his golden amber eyes burning with something cruel, something victorious. The Alpha of Eclipse Dominion was everything she despised, a conqueror, a warlord, the monster who had torn her family apart. The black cloak draped over his broad shoulders was untouched by blood, his dark tunic fitted like armor against his towering frame. Unlike her, whose body bore the evidence of battle, Darius had not even needed to break a sweat. His warriors had done the dirty work for him, and now he stood before her like a king surveying the wreckage of his newest conquest. Seline clenched her teeth so hard her jaw ached. "Your pack is gone," Darius said smoothly, stepping closer, his boots crunching over the rubble and bones that paved the battlefield. "Your warriors are dead. Your Alpha," her father. Seline sucked in a breath, willing the grief to stay buried. Darius crouched in front of her, lowering himself so their gazes met. His scent, dark cedar, iron and power, wrapped around her like a noose. "All that remains is you, princess. Princess." The word curled in his mouth like a cruel joke, as if she were some spoiled little noble clinging to a throne she had never earned. "He knew nothing." Seline's breath hitched, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Kill me." Darius studied her, the edges of his mouth quirking upward in something too smug, too knowing. "No?" She flinched, despite herself. "No? I want you to kneel," he murmured, his voice dropping lower, dangerously smooth. "I want you to bow your head, accept your fate, and surrender." Seline's pulse roared in her ears. Surrender. Her fingers curled into fists behind her back. She had fought until her arms bled, until her knees buckled beneath the weight of the fallen. She had cut through Eclipse Dominion warriors like a blade through silk, had ripped throats with her claws, carved through flesh with her steel. But in the end, she had lost. She had fallen. A flash of memory slammed into her as sharp as a blade to the gut. Seline stood at the crumbling gates of Lunacrest, her breathing heavy, her sword slick with blood. The Eclipse Dominion army had come like a storm, a force of death and destruction sweeping over their land. Hundreds of warriors, thousands, they had struck with precision, their alphas leading the charge. Seline had fought. Gods, she had fought. She had slashed and parried, driven her blade through enemy after enemy. She had felt her wolf thrash within her, desperate to break free, to tear through the battlefield and bathe in vengeance. But even she could not stop what was coming. The moment she saw Darius Voss step onto the battlefield, she had known that the war was already lost. His warriors had flooded the stronghold, overwhelming them, ripping apart her soldiers like wolves tearing through deer. And in the end, after hours of battle, Darius had come for her personally. He had stood among the dead unscathed, as if war itself bent around him. Seline had lunged for him, her sword slicing toward his throat, but Darius was fast. Faster than any man had the right to be. He had dodged her strike with ease, disarming her in a single brutal motion. A swift kick to her ribs had sent her sprawling into the mud, the wind knocked from her lungs, and then the world had gone dark. Seline's fingers twitched against the damp earth as the memory burned in her mind. Darius had defeated her effortlessly, and he had let her live. Her hatred surged like wildfire. "Say it!" Darius murmured, his voice as smooth as silk. "Surrender, and I will make it easy for you." "Easy!" She bit back a laugh. There was nothing easy about this. Seline tilted her head back, looking up at him with burning silver eyes. "And then," she spat. A glob of blood and dirt landed on the polished leather of his boot. For a long moment silence stretched between them. The battlefield, the fires, the screams, all of it faded. Darius slowly, deliberately looked down at his boot. Then he lifted his gaze back to her, something dark and dangerous flickering behind those golden eyes. Seline met his stare without flinching. She might be broken, she might be bleeding in the dirt, kneeling before her enemy, but she would not yield. Darius exhaled softly, almost amused. Then, without warning, he grabbed her by the throat. Seline gasped as she was hauled upward, her knees leaving the earth, her bound hands straining behind her. "You," Darius murmured, low and deliberate, his fingers tightening just enough to make her breath stutter, "are going to be fun." Seline bared her teeth, refusing to be cowed. "Go to hell." Darius's smirk widened. "Ooh, little wolf." He leaned in, his lips ghosting over her ear. "You're coming with me." And just like that, her world shattered. Seline forced herself to hold Darius Voss's gaze, even as his fingers remained wrapped around her throat, his grip firm but not tight enough to choke. His golden amber eyes flickered with something dark, something unreadable. For a man who had just destroyed her world, he looked amused. His black leather gloves creaked as he loosened his hold, his fingers trailing the column of her throat as he withdrew. "You're quite the little fighter," he murmured. "That's good. I enjoy watching people fight for hope before I rip it from them." Seline refused to shudder, refused to show even an ounce of the fear that clawed its way up her spine. Instead, she squared her shoulders, ignoring the sharp pain in her ribs. "Then you'll be disappointed, because I have none left to give." Darius tilted his head, his dark hair catching the glow of the still-burning remains of Lunar Crest's once magnificent stronghold. The fires cast shadows along his sharp, unforgiving features, making him look even more like the predator he was. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "We'll see about that." Behind him his warriors stood silent, watching with sharp predatory interest. They weren't just here to conquer, they were here to break, to remake, to strip away everything Seline had once been, and Darius had no intention of making her death swift. The realization struck her cold. He wasn't going to kill her. He wanted something worse. Seline lifted her chin. "Get it over with." Darius smirked. "You think this is over? That death is your only option?" He took a slow step closer, his boots crushing broken weapons, shattered remnants of her warriors, her people. The world narrowed to the space between them. "I could kill you," he admitted, voice low, mockingly thoughtful. "It would be easy." His gaze flicked over her face, studying her as if deciding just how much pleasure he would get from dragging out her suffering. "But I don't like easy." Seline swallowed back the rising bile in her throat. "I prefer to take my time," Darius continued, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of her blood-soaked hair behind her ear. The casual, almost intimate gesture made her stomach turn. "To mold people into what they never wanted to become." Seline wanted to recoil, wanted to rip his hand away, but her wrists were still bound behind her back, the silver-infused shackles keeping her from shifting. She stared up at him, refusing to blink, refusing to break. His smirk widened. "I will make you kneel for me, Seline." His voice was velvet-lined steel, soft but deadly. "And when you do, it won't be because I forced you. It'll be because you finally realize there is no other choice. A sharp pang of fury shot through her chest, drowning the ache in her body, the sting of her wounds. "You are delusional," Darius chuckled. "I've been called worse." Seline braced for a strike, a killing blow, anything. But instead, he turned to his warriors and gave a simple order: chain her. Take her to the dungeons. The shackles burned against her wrists, the silver woven into the steel thrumming against her skin, keeping her wolf suppressed. A leash for a caged animal. The two guards flanking her yanked her forward, their hands gripping her upper arms with bruising force. Seline dug her heels into the scorched earth, refusing to be dragged like a piece of discarded meat, but the fight had drained from her limbs, her body exhausted, every bruise and cut screaming for relief. Still she resisted. One of the guards growled and yanked harder, sending her stumbling forward, her knees hitting the blood-stained ground. Pain lanced through her ribs. Laughter, low and mocking, coming from the warriors watching her fall. Seline clenched her jaw, glaring up through a curtain of tangled black hair, her silver eyes burning with hatred. One of the warriors sneered. "Maybe she should crawl the rest of the way?" Seline bared her teeth. "Come closer and say that." The warrior's smirk faltered, just a little. The next thing she knew, a boot collided with her side, knocking the air from her lungs. She gasped, sucking in smoke and pain, but forced herself not to collapse. A hand wrapped around her hair, yanking her up. "Darius!" His grip was firm, but he didn't yank too hard. Just enough to force her to look up at him, to see the victory written across his sharp features. His golden eyes gleamed. "You will learn, little wolf," he murmured, so low only she could hear. "I am very, very patient." Seline wanted to spit in his face again, wanted to tear out his throat with her teeth, but she had no power here. Not yet. He released her hair, stepping back with slow, deliberate ease, as if he had already decided exactly how much suffering she would endure before she broke, and then he nodded to the guards. They yanked her forward once more, dragging her toward the ruins of what had once been her home, toward the dungeons of Eclipse Dominion, toward hell. And this time, she had no choice but to go. Sane scrubbed at the polished stone floor, the scent of lavender soap and old blood curling into her nose as her bruised fingers ached from the cold water. 2 weeks, that was how long she had been here. 2 weeks of waking before the sun, of being herded like an animal, of being stripped of the name warrior and given only one title, servant. The former princess of the lunar crest pack, the last surviving heir of a proud bloodline, now reduced to scrubbing the filth of her enemies. She gritted her teeth and wrung out the rag, the icy water biting into her already raw skin. Her knees ached against the marble, but she didn't shift position, wouldn't give the guards watching from the door the satisfaction of seeing her in discomfort. The Eclipse Dominion stronghold was nothing like her home had been. Lunar Crest had been wild and free, a pack built alongside the land, blending into the mountains like an extension of the earth itself. But this place, it was a palace of predators. The high ceilings were adorned with silver banners, the eclipse sigil stitched into the fabric, a full moon split in half by a claw. Thick stone columns lined the hall, torchlight casting eerie golden reflections against the obsidian walls. Unlike the warmth of Lunar Crest, this place reeked of dominance, of cruelty dressed as civility. And she was its prisoner. The distant murmur of voices stilled her hand. Seline froze, tightening her grip on the rag, her breath softening as she tuned her ears to the conversation filtering through the open archway ahead. Alphas. She recognized the voices instantly. "You're losing control of the western borders," a voice drawled, smooth, amused with a barely concealed edge of mockery. Cassel Draven. Seline could picture him perfectly without needing to look. Golden bronze skin, piercing green eyes that saw too much, dark curls tousled just so. "I am in control of everything," came the low, cold reply. "Darius!" Seline clenched her jaw, the familiar weight of hatred pressing against her ribs. Darius never raised his voice. He never needed to. His authority was the kind that sent wolves to their knees with a single glance. Another voice joined in, this one gravel-rough and edged with amusement. "That's not what the rebels in the Shadowlands are saying," he mused. "Sounds like they don't fear you as much as they should." Seline's stomach tightened. She had heard stories of him long before the war. A rogue alpha. A warlord with no pack, no loyalty, only blood on his hands and chaos in his wake. And yet he had sided with Darius in the war. Seline had wondered why. No rogue ever aligned himself with a tyrant, yet here he was in the halls of Eclipse Dominion speaking to Darius as if they were equals. A fourth voice, lower and quieter than the others, murmured, "The unrest will only grow if we do not handle it swiftly." Lucien Blackwood. Seline shivered. Unlike the others, Lucien had always unnerved her. There was something haunted about him, something unspoken in the way he carried himself, like a man walking a thin line between salvation and damn. "Perhaps we should make an example of the rebels," Cassel suggested lazily. "A very public one." Seline's stomach twisted. "Enough," Darius said flatly. "This conversation is over." Seline barely had time to snap her gaze back to her work before the sound of approaching boots sent a cold spike of warning down her spine. She kept her head down as 4 sets of boots stopped just beyond the bucket at her side. The air changed. Heavier, sharper, charged. She could feel their eyes on her. Seline inhaled slowly, forcing herself to keep scrubbing, her fingers aching against the slick stone. "Didn't take you for the domestic type, little warrior?" Kieran's voice reached her first. Seline stiffened. His voice was lazy, teasing, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of interest beneath the words. She could hear the smirk in his tone, the amusement curling around each syllable. She didn't look up, didn't give him the reaction he wanted. "Shame," Kieran continued, his boots stopping just beside her, close enough that she could see the leather straps of his combat gear, the hilt of a blade resting against his thigh. "You had such fire before." Seline's fingers tightened around the rag, but she forced herself to remain silent. Kieran crouched beside her then, his glacial blue eyes studying her with something dangerously close to curiosity. "What do you think, Darius?" he asked over his shoulder. "Tamed yet?" Seline felt her pulse spike at the deep, steady exhale from above. Darius. She knew without looking that he was standing directly behind her, watching. His presence was a weight, an unspoken command. Darius did nothing without reason, and yet he said nothing now. Seline swallowed against the bitter sting of humiliation rising in her throat. Slowly she lifted her gaze, her silver eyes burning with defiance as she met Kieran's stare head-on. Not tamed, not broken. Kieran's grin widened. "Well, damn," he murmured. "Maybe we should keep her." Cassel chuckled. "Oh, I do like her." Lucien remained silent, but Darius only watched. Seline turned her gaze to him, meeting those ruthless golden eyes with every ounce of defiance she still had left. If he wanted her broken, he would have to try harder. For a long, stretched-out moment, Darius said nothing. Then, finally, a single word, "Rise." Seline gritted her teeth. "Refused." Darius tilted his head, his gaze sharpening, as if he could see the battle waging inside her. A pause, then his voice dropped to a low, chilling command. "I said, rise." A tremor ran through her limbs, because this time she had no choice. Seline's fingers curled around the rag, her knuckles turning white as she scrubbed at the dried stains smearing the stone. The scent of old iron mixed with the sharp tang of cleaning soap, a nauseating combination that burned in her nostrils, sat thick on her tongue. She refused to think about whose blood she was wiping away. It was someone's son, someone's father, someone who had fought until the last breath. Someone like her. The grand hall of Eclipse Dominium's stronghold stretched before her, its high vaulted ceilings lined with black banners, the sigil of the pack, a split moon with a claw slashed through its centre, staring down at her like an omen. Lunacress had been wild, untamed, a kingdom of warriors who thrived beneath the stars. Eclipse Dominion was something else entirely, cold, ruthless, silent as a graveyard. Her new home. Seline would rather die. The bucket at her side sloshed as she wrung the rag again, biting down the hiss of pain that licked at her wrists, raw and sore from 2 weeks of servitude. Her once pristine hands that had gripped swords, commanded armies, clawed through enemy flesh, were now nothing but a servant's hands. Beneath them, and yet, despite the throbbing ache in her body, despite the bruises that painted her ribs in dark, violent smears, she didn't stop, because stopping meant breaking, and she would never break. A presence flickered at the edge of her awareness. Seline stiffened, her spine locking. Lucien Blackwood. She didn't need to look to know it was him. His presence was different from the others. Less oppressive than Darius, less cocky than Kieran, less sickly sweet than Cassel. Lucien was a ghost wrapped in flesh, something haunted and broken, and yet his power was no less suffocating. Slowly, Seline lifted her gaze. He stood just beyond the archway, watching her. His violet eyes, that strange unnatural glow, caught the torchlight, casting an eerie shimmer against his pale skin. Lucien wasn't as built as Darius or Kieran, but he carried himself like a man who didn't need muscle to kill. His long blonde hair, dishevelled from the wind, framed the harsh cut of his face. Unlike the others, he wasn't adorned in the same warlord's armour, a simple black tunic and leather trousers. No weapons strapped to his body, as if he didn't need them, as if his curse was weapon enough. Seline's fingers tightened around the rag. She hated that he was watching her, hated even more that he wasn't mocking her, because that would be easier. If he sneered at her, if he treated her like Cassel did, like Kieran did, she could throw that rage right back in his face. But Lucien, he only watched, and for some reason that felt worse. "Do you think," he said finally, his voice quiet, rough, "that scrubbing the floor will change anything?" Seline stiffened. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her wolf clawing inside her chest, whispering to her, "Fight him, fight them all." "I think," she said, voice steady, "that you should go fuck yourself." Lucien didn't blink, didn't react. If anything, his expression softened, a flicker of something she couldn't name, something deep, something unreadable, and then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Seline sat there, kneeling on the cold floor, her chest heaving. She had no idea why, but for the first time since she had been brought here, she felt like she'd lost something. "Ah, there she is!" A voice like silken knives purred from above her. Seline's teeth ground together as she wiped the last smear of blood from the stone. Cassel Draven. If Lucien was silent shadows, Cassel was the kind of darkness that wrapped around your throat and whispered pretty lies. She felt him before she saw him, the heat of his presence pressing in against her skin. Cassel always moved like he had nothing but time and patience, a man whose confidence didn't need to be loud to be dangerous. Seline didn't look up. She didn't want to see the smug smile he was undoubtedly wearing, the way his emerald green eyes glowed with amusement. "Still on your knees," he mused. "How fitting." Seline's hand tightened around the rag, but she kept her head bowed, refused to react. Because he wanted her to. He thrived on it. Cassel crouched in front of her, his black velvet coat shifting around him, the silver rings on his fingers glinting in the firelight. He rested an elbow on his knee, his chin on his fist, peering at her like she was something intriguing, something to play with. "You know," he murmured, voice almost kind, "I think I liked you better covered in blood. At least then you had some dignity." Seline's breath came sharp and controlled. She had spent 2 weeks being kicked, ignored, starved. She had spent 2 weeks hearing their laughter, their whispered words, their mockery. She had spent 2 weeks being nothing. And yet nothing inside her had shattered. Her fingers flexed. She wanted to rip him apart. Cassel tilted his head. "Oh, I do love that look in your eyes." Seline forced her face blank. He couldn't have this. None of them could. So she inhaled, slow and steady, and offered the sweetest, most empty smile she could manage. "Let me guess," she murmured. "Your cock is hard right now." Cassel barked out a laugh, low, rich, genuine. He grinned at her, all teeth and danger. "Gods, you are fun," he sighed, rising to his feet with an ease that made her stomach turn. "I can't wait to see what Darius does to you." Seline swallowed, keeping her expression frozen, even as his words dug under her skin like claws. Cassel turned, walking toward the grand hall, his laughter still echoing in her ears. That night her wolf came to her. Seline lay curled on the cold stone floor of her servant's chamber, the bruises on her ribs throbbing with each shallow breath. The distant sound of the moon-wolves howling outside the keep stirred in her bones, their mournful song pressing against her skin. Sleep took her reluctantly, and in the darkness she saw herself, not as she was now, not broken, not caged, but as she had once been, a silver-mine beast, wild and untamed, standing atop a mountain ridge, her muzzle dripping with the blood of her enemies. The wind howled, and her wolf spoke. "You are not done." The vision burned in her mind, a whisper of what she could be again, of what she would become. Seline woke with a start, her chest heaving, and for the first time in 2 weeks, she felt alive. She would survive. She would rise. And when she did, she would kill them all. Chapter 2. The Harem Pact. Seline stood in the center of the vast circular hall, her hands clenched into fists, her silver eyes burning as she stared at the wolves who had destroyed her world. The elders of Eclipse Dominion sat upon raised stone thrones, their faces carved from the same granite as the walls behind them, ancient, unyielding, and steeped in the weight of 1,000 years of bloodshed. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a steady war drum of fury and defiance. At the front of the chamber, seated on a throne of obsidian and iron, sat Alpha Darius Voss. He didn't speak. Didn't have to, not when the entire room bent to his silent authority. Seline's stomach curled as the eldest of the council, a man with silver hair and a scar across his blind eye, rose to his feet. "This war has raged long enough," the elder declared, his voice carved from stone and winter. "Blood has been spilled, packs have been lost, and yet still the wolves of these lands remain divided." Seline's fingernails dug into her palms. She didn't care about their war, their politics. The only thing that mattered was that Lunar Crest had been wiped from existence. Because of them. "The Harem Pact," the elder continued, "is the only way forward." The words dropped into the air like a death sentence. Seline's breath hitched. A sharp, slicing sound rang out as she spat her words like a blade. "I would rather die." The silence was instant, heavy, unforgiving. Darius' golden gaze flicked toward her, unreadable. His jaw chuckled from his seat beside Darius, his emerald eyes flashing with amusement. "Oh, sweetheart," he murmured, tipping his head to the side, studying her like she was a puzzle he already knew the answer to. "You don't get to choose." Seline's vision tinted red. "You expect me," she growled, "to lay with my enemies?" The elder's face remained impassive. "The rule, you must first survive." Seline bristled. "You're saying I can't do one without the other?" The elder ignored her. "You will be bound to the Alphas of Eclipse Dominion, to Darius, Cassel, Lucien, and Kieran. As Lunar Queen, you will command power that no single Alpha can wield alone. The mate bond will unify our forces and ensure that no war is waged again." Seline felt sick. Bound to them, to Darius, the man who had burned her world to the ground, to Cassel, the snake whose eyes gleamed with nothing but mockery and deceit, to Lucien, the silent ghost of a man who watched but never spoke, whose violet eyes held secrets she didn't want to uncover, and to Kieran, the rogue Alpha, the smirking bastard who had watched her suffering with something too close to fascination. The rage that had been smouldering beneath her skin ignited. She took a step forward, lifting her chin, baring her teeth. "You want me to mate with them?" Her voice was sharp enough to cut. "I'd rather have my throat torn out." Darius stood. The movement was calm, measured. It shouldn't have sent ice through her veins, but it did. He stepped down from his throne, closing the space between them with a slow, deliberate ease. When he stopped inches from her, she had to fight the urge to step back. He studied her, his golden amber gaze searing into hers. Then he spoke. Low, lethal. "You misunderstand something, Seline." Her pulse roared in her ears. His voice was quiet when he said it, but it filled the room nonetheless. "You have no choice." Seline's body locked as Darius lifted a single gloved hand. He didn't touch her, didn't have to. His presence alone was a noose tightening around her throat. "If you refuse," he murmured, "then your people die." The words hit her like a blade to the gut. Her breathing faltered, and she hated that it did. Darius watched her closely, his expression unreadable. "Your refusal means the extermination of every remaining Lunar Crest survivor." His voice was smooth, cruel. "The old, the sick, the ones who ran." Seline's stomach twisted. Her wolves, the last of them, still alive, still hiding out in the mountains beyond the Shadowlands, clinging to the last remnants of a world that no longer existed. If she refused, Darius would hunt them down, slaughter them, erase Lunar Crest from history. Her throat felt tight. Darius tilted his head, watching the war play out in her silver eyes. Then he stepped closer, his words soft but sharp enough to flay her open. "So," he murmured, "which will it be?" Silence pressed against her ribs like a closing vice. And then Kieran laughed, a deep, amused rumble that broke the tension just enough to shift the air. Seline's gaze snapped to the rogue Alpha, her wolf snarling beneath her skin. He was watching her the way a predator watches something fascinating, something worth chasing. Kieran pushed off the stone pillar where he had been leaning with lazy ease, his sharp blue eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "Or," he said, dragging the word out like a cat playing with its food, "you could take a different approach." Seline narrowed her eyes. "What?" Kieran's grin widened. "Why not rule us instead?" A sharp pulse thudded in her chest. Kieran took a slow step forward, his leather-clad fingers brushing the hilt of the dagger strapped to his thigh. "You're a wire, little wolf," he mused. "You could be more than a pawn." His gaze flicked to Darius before returning to her. "You could be a queen." Seline's breath came sharp, shaky, because for the first time she wasn't sure if it was a taunt or a promise. And that was far more dangerous. Seline stood in the center of the Eclipse Dominion Council Hall, her wrists still raw from the silver shackles they had finally removed. But her freedom was an illusion. She might as well still be in chains. Every gaze in the room bore down on her. The elders, the alphas, the men who had conquered her world and now dared to tell her she would be their queen. Harem pact. The words echoed in her mind, venomous and suffocating. They wanted her to mate with them, to bind herself to the four most dangerous alphas in existence, to become Lunar Queen, not through battle, but through a collar they would clasp around her throat. She gritted her teeth. She would rather bleed out on this floor. Silence stretched as the elders awaited her answer. Seline's voice, sharp and filled with steel, sliced through the still air. "I refuse." Her words rang out like a battle cry. The room stilled. For a moment there was nothing, only the crackle of the torches against the high stone walls. Then, a low chuckle. "Cassel Draven?" Seline's eyes snapped toward him. hatred curling in her veins at the way he lounged so easily, so carelessly, as if none of this mattered, as if she were nothing more than a piece on a board he had already won. The golden bronze Alpha, his emerald green eyes glinting with amusement, tilted his head. His dark curls fell slightly over his brow as he exhaled, the sound more indulgent than irritated. He mused, rubbing his jaw as if the very idea amused him. His gaze flicked down her body, lingering before meeting her eyes again. "Oh, sweetheart." His lips curled, slow and dangerous. "You don't have that luxury," Seline bristled. "I will not belong to you," she spat. Cassiel's expression didn't change, but there was something in his smug, knowing stare that made her stomach turn. "No," he said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You belong to all of us." Seline's vision flashed red. Her wolf snapped inside her, the instinct to fight, to kill, to rip him apart so violent that she had to physically dig her nails into her palm to restrain herself. She should have known Cassel would be the first to taunt her. He was a deceiver, a silver-tongued devil wrapped in silken daggers, but this time he wasn't just trying to break her spirit. He was dangling something else in front of her. Power. She felt it before he spoke it. "You could have it all," Cassel murmured, his tone a whisper of temptation, low and coaxing. "The throne, the power. You could rule beside us." Seline's heart slammed against her ribs. No, he was lying, twisting the truth like a blade against her throat, because this was not power. This was submission disguised as a crown. She lifted her chin, her voice cutting and sharp as a blade. "I will never be yours." Cassel only smiled. "That's what you think now, little queen." A cold breath of air brushed against her skin. "Lucien." She didn't need to look to know he was standing at the edge of the room, his presence as quiet as a ghost's shadow. He had barely spoken since the meeting began. But now... His voice slid through the room like a warning. "There is more at play than you know." Seline tensed. Lucien was different from the others, not cruel like Darius, not amused like Cassel, not reckless like Kieran. Lucien carried a quiet kind of danger, something cold and heavy like a blade yet to be drawn. And now those glowing violet eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath stutter. Seline swallowed. She didn't want to ask, didn't want to care, but the words slipped out anyway. "What are you talking about?" Lucien's expression didn't change. "There is more to this than a throne," he murmured. "More to this." The weight of his words settled into her bones. Seline's jaw locked. She didn't trust him, didn't trust any of them. But something about the way he said it, as if he was warning her, as if he knew something she didn't, a chill spread through her veins. But before she could ask more, Darius moved. She didn't flinch when Darius stepped toward her, didn't waver under the full force of his golden gaze. But she felt it, the weight, the power, the command. "Choose," he said simply. No emotion, no hesitation. A demand. Seline's fingers curled into fists at her sides. They had already taken everything from her, and now they wanted to strip her of the last thing she had left, her choice. The rage inside her burned white, hot, but her wolves were still out there, hiding, running. If she refused, Darius would have them hunted down. If she refused, the last remnants of her people would die. She inhaled slowly, held it, then exhaled, and spoke the words that would seal her fate. "I accept." But in her heart she vowed she would never bow to them. She would never be theirs. And one day she would make them pay for this. The moonlight poured through the high-arched windows of the Eclipse Dominion's sacred chamber, silver streams catching on the heavy folds of Seline's new garments. Moon-silver robes, rich and flowing, replaced the threadbare rags of servitude she had worn for the past weeks. Her hands, once raw and bruised from scrubbing floors, were now softened with crushed pearl powder. Her thick black hair, once tangled and matted from neglect, was washed, combed through until it cascaded down her back in soft, wild waves, a stark contrast to the rigid, ceremonial braids worn by the noblewomen of Eclipse Dominion. They had dressed her like a queen, but a queen with chains disguised as silk. Seline stood in the center of the sacred stone dais, her back straight, unyielding, as she met the gazes of the 4 alphas who were about to claim her. Not as a mate, not as an equal, but as their conquest. Her stomach curled with fury. She did not belong to them, and yet, tonight, they would mark her as if she did. The elders sat in the shadows, silent observers, their robes blending into the darkened corners of the chamber. The flickering torchlight cast jagged patterns on the stone walls, illuminating the ancient runes of binding carved into the floor beneath her feet. This was not just a ceremony. This was a branding, a ritual that would bind her to them, to Darius, Cassel, Lucien, and Kieran, a union of power and submission, and Seline would never forget it. A single voice rang out. The high priest's incantation, the words thick with old magic. It curled around her like smoke, like chains, wrapping tight against her skin, pressing against her wolf, forcing her into submission. She clenched her teeth, her nails digging into her palms. The first to step forward was Darius. His towering frame cast a shadow over her, his golden amber eyes unreadable, his face a mask of calm, unshaken dominance. He didn't hesitate, didn't offer her a chance to brace herself. His fingers gripped her wrist, the strength in his hands making her breath stutter just for a moment. She didn't look away, she refused to. His touch was firm, unrelenting, as he lifted her arm and pressed his clawed thumb against the delicate skin of her inner wrist. And then a sharp, searing heat bloomed where his touch met her skin. His mark burned into her flesh, his essence merging with hers, a deep golden imprint of his dominance. She clenched her jaw, refusing to let out the smallest sound of discomfort. Darius' lips curved slightly, just barely, as if pleased that she hadn't flinched. When he finally stepped back, his golden gaze lingered on her for a fraction too long, before he turned and strode away. The next was Cassel. He moved like liquid sin, his emerald green eyes dripping with amusement as he took her hand with a gentleness that made her want to rip it away. Cassel didn't hurt her, he didn't need to. His fingers trailed along her forearm first, slow and teasing, before his touch settled over the same place Darius had marked. His magic slid over her skin like silk, like smoke, until his mark burned against her flesh, a deep emerald, entwining with the Cassel leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You wear us well, little queen," he murmured, his voice soft, mocking. Seline ignored him. Lucien was next. He didn't touch her as easily as the others had. Instead, he hesitated, his violet gaze flickering with something strange, something that made her stomach tighten. When he finally lifted his hand, he pressed his mark onto her skin without a word. And yet, his touch was cool, steady, sending a shiver up her spine. Unlike the others, Lucien didn't linger. As soon as his mark settled into her flesh, he was gone. And then, Kieran. Seline braced herself, because if there was one wolf she knew would push her limits, it was him. Kieran moved with slow, lazy ease, his sharp blue eyes flickering with something dark, something playful. He tilted his head as he stepped close, so close she could feel the heat of him, the raw scent of leather and pine. Unlike the others, he didn't immediately place his mark. Instead, he lifted a single, calloused finger, tracing an agonizingly slow line from her wrist to her elbow. Seline's breath hitched. His touch wasn't painful, it was worse. It was deliberate. His gaze met hers, a smirk playing at his lips. "Easy, little wolf," he murmured. His thumb pressed against the spot where the other marks lay, and his magic curled around her like a second skin. Then heat, not sharp like Darius, not teasing like Cassel, not distant like Lucien, deep, smouldering, dangerous. Seline felt it curl inside her, raw and consuming, something that wasn't pain, but something that left her gasping nonetheless. Her vision blurred just for a second, and Kieran? He noticed. His smirk deepened, his voice dropping lower, softer. "There we go," he whispered. Then he stepped back. Seline's breath came shallow, quick. Her skin burned with their marks, 4 different sensations pressing into her, staking a claim that she didn't want to accept. And yet, it was done. She was bound. Lunar Queen of Eclipse Dominion, a prisoner in silk. But as the final words of the ritual settled over her, she lifted her chin. She was not theirs, not yet. And one day she would make them regret ever thinking they could own her. The air inside the sacred chamber felt thick with magic, the scent of burning herbs and smouldering incense curling around Seline like a second skin. The runes etched into the obsidian floor pulsed, silver light flickering in rhythmic beats, as if the very walls of the Eclipse Dominion stronghold were breathing in anticipation. She stood at the center of it all, dressed like a queen, but feeling like a sacrifice. Her robes, crafted from moon-silver silk, clung to her curves, pooling around her feet like liquid starlight. The delicate embroidery-woven strands of black and gold thread marked her as Lunar Queen, but the crown was invisible, unseen. Instead, her new throne was built of chains. The 4 alphas stood before her, their golden, emerald, violet, and ice blue eyes locked onto her like predators awaiting the final claim. This was the moment she had dreaded most, the moment her flesh would be branded with their power, her wolf bound to them in ways she could never undo. The elders' voices rose in ancient chants, echoing across the chamber. The words curled around her like unseen shackles, sealing the magic, sealing her fate. And then Lucien stepped forward. He was different from the others. Darius was ruthless. Cassel was calculating. Kieran was wild. But Lucien was quiet. A man who held darkness inside him the way others held weapons. His glowing violet eyes flickered with something unreadable as he reached for her, his fingers hovering just inches from her skin. Seline swallowed. Of all of them, his touch unnerved her most, because he wasn't supposed to hesitate. The other 3 alphas had branded her without pause, without thought. But Lucien! He stared at the place where the others' marks already burned against her wrist. Gold from Darius, emerald from Cassel, ice bull from Kieran. His hand trembled just slightly. Then he curled his fingers into a fist, his jaw locking. "Lucien!" Darius' voice was calm, but edged with warning. Lucien exhaled sharply, then reached out. The moment his fingers brushed against her wrist, Seline felt it. A cold, sharp pulse of energy threading through her, sinking into her bones, her blood, her very being. Lucien shuddered. Seline's breath caught. Because for a fraction of a second, a single heartbeat, she swore she felt something breaking inside him too. His gaze flicked up, meeting hers, and something in his violet eyes burned. Regret, longing, resignation. Lucien pulled his hand back as if it had burned him. Seline's heart slammed against her ribs, but before she could even process it, Cassel moved in behind her. If Lucien was ice, Cassel was fire. His presence curled around her like silk, warm, teasing, undeniably lethal. Seline stiffened, her fingers twitching as his breath ghosted against her ear. "I have to say," he murmured, his voice all dark velvet and sin, "I'm going to enjoy having you." Seline's stomach tightened. His fingers traced up her bare arm, featherlight yet possessive. "You put up such a fight, little queen," he continued, voice low, coaxing. "But deep down we both know." His thumb brushed just below her pulse point, and a wave of magic and heat coiled around her. "You already belong to us," Seline's wolf snarled. She jerked her arm back, ripping away from his touch, glaring up at him with nothing but pure, unyielding defiance. Cassel laughed, low and deep, as if she had given him exactly what he wanted. He mused. those emerald eyes gleaming. This is going to be fun. The ceremony was complete. The final chant faded into silence, the elders stepping back as the magic sealed itself inside her. Her wrist burned, the foremarks pulsing with heat, with raw, undeniable power. Seline stood tall, her breath slow and controlled, refusing to show even an ounce of weakness. Darius, Kieran, Lucien, and Cassel watched her, each with their own expression. Darius, cold, satisfied, knowing. Kieran, amused, darkly intrigued, a predator considering its prey. Lucien, withdrawn, silent, but something inside him was unsettled. Cassel, smirking, wicked, his emerald eyes filled with nothing but pure, shameless enjoyment. Seline's fingers curled. They thought they owned her, but as she looked at each of them, felt the weight of their power settling inside her, binding her to them, a slow, sharp smile curled at the edge of her lips, because none of them realized what they had just done. They hadn't just bound her to them, they had bound themselves to her, and one day she would make them regret it. Seline had spent weeks surviving, weeks of being watched, tested, pushed to the edge. But if the Alphas of Eclipse Dominion thought she would bow to them like a broken wolf, they were about to learn a painful lesson, because she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was planning, she was rising, and today she would prove it. The Eclipse Dominion stronghold was built for war. The training ground stretched wide, the earth packed hard with centuries of blood and sweat. Beyond the black stone walls, the howl of the wind carried the distant calls of the wild packs, but here there was only the sound of steel clashing, the scent of raw dominance in the air. Seline stood in the center, barefoot, her body poised and ready. Her moon-silver training leathers clung to her form, molded for movement, not decoration. Her long black hair was braided tightly away from her face, but a few loose strands stuck to the damp sweat along her temple. The Alphas surrounded her in a loose circle, their presence as heavy as a closing trap. This wasn't a lesson. This was a test. And Darius was the first to step forward. His golden amber gaze was unreadable, his body a wall of muscle and restraint, dressed in black leather and steel, his hands wrapped in combat straps. Seline had watched him fight before. She had seen him command armies, tear through warriors without breaking a sweat. But now she was facing him. And he didn't hold back. He lunged. Seline barely had time to react before his arm swung out, aiming for her ribs. She twisted at the last second, dodging, spinning away. Darius grinned, slow and knowing. Not bad, his eyes said, but not good enough. Seline didn't wait for him to come at her again. She attacked first. Her knee shot up, aiming for his side, but he blocked it effortlessly, catching her leg and twisting her balance. She went down, but only for a second. Before her back even hit the dirt, she twisted mid-fall, using the momentum to sweep her leg out, knocking Darius' knee. It barely made him stumble, but his smirk vanished. And that was a small victory. "You're fast," he murmured, circling her now, his predatory gaze assessing. Seline wiped the sweat from her brow, refusing to break eye contact. "And you're predictable." Cassel chuckled from the sidelines. "Oh, why'd I care?" he mused. "She has claws." Seline ignored him. Darius attacked again. This time harder, his fists came quick, precise, relentless. Seline barely managed to block his strikes, the force behind them sending tremors through her arms. But she was holding her ground, and she could see the flicker of approval in his eyes. Darius moved to end it. He swept low, aiming to pin her beneath him, but Seline saw it coming. She ducked, rolled, and the moment he was off balance, she struck. Her elbows slammed into his ribs, hard enough to make him grunt, and then she flipped him. For a brief, fleeting second, Darius Voss was on his back. The world seemed to hold its breath. The warriors watching froze. Seline stood over him, breathing hard, fire in her eyes. And Darius? Darius lay there for a moment, staring up at her, his golden gaze burning with something unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, he smiled. Seline knew she hadn't won, not truly, but she had proven something. As she stepped back, Darius rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his shoulder, his eyes still locked onto hers. "You're not weak," he murmured. Seline lifted her chin. "I never was." Kieran let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered, grinning. "I knew you had fight in you, but I didn't think you'd put the great Alpha Voss on his ass." Cassel was watching her differently now. Less amusement, more interest. Lucien, silent as always, simply inclined his head. "And Darius?" He took a step toward her, lowering his voice. "This changes nothing," he murmured. Seline's pulse thrummed as she stared up at him, but she only smirked. "We'll see." Seline had spent weeks being watched, studied, tested. She had endured servitude, the weight of binding magic, and the claim of 4 powerful alphas who thought she would bend to them. But they had miscalculated. Because Seline Nightbane did not kneel, she had allowed them to believe she was adjusting, that she was learning her place. What they didn't realize was she was learning theirs, and tonight she would begin rewriting the rules. The training grounds had long since emptied. The others had left, but Kieran remained. Seline wiped sweat from her brow, her body still thrumming from combat, from proving herself. Kieran leaned against the stone wall, arms crossed, his ice-mute eyes glinting under the torchlight. "Damned little wolf," he mused, his voice low and taunting. "If I didn't know better, I'd think you were actually trying to impress us." Seline smirked, rolling the tension from her shoulders. "If I wanted to impress you, Kieran, you'd be on your back like Darius was." His grin widened, sharp and dangerous. "Oh, sweetheart." He pushed off the wall, moving closer, his scent pine and something darker wrapping around her. "I like being on my back. Just not in a fight." Seline arched a brow. "I don't care what you like." Kieran's gaze darkened, a flicker of something deadly beneath the amusement. Seline knew the type. Men like Kieran, they were the ones you underestimated at your own peril. "Don't you?" he murmured. "You should, you know." "Care?" Seline held her ground as he stepped close, close enough that his breath was warm against her cheek. "You play rough," he said softly. "But have you ever played for keeps?" Seline's wolf stirred, not out of attraction, out of challenge. She tilted her head, letting the silence stretch just enough before whispering, "You'll find out if you push me far enough." Kieran's lips curved, and for the first time she realized he liked the idea of that. Later that night, Seline found herself at the northern tower, away from the others. She wasn't alone. Lucien stood by the arched window, his silhouette framed against the deep indigo sky. Seline hesitated. Lucien wasn't like the others. She didn't know what to make of him. He was haunted, restrained, something dark coiled beneath the surface, something dangerous, something broken, but not cruel, not in the way the others were. "You don't belong here," she said finally, stepping closer. Lucien's shoulders tensed, his violet gaze flicking toward her. "Neither do you," Seline exhaled a quiet laugh. "I know that. But you could have left." Lucien turned fully then, his face illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight. His eyes, for the first time, weren't cold, they were raw. "I've tried," he admitted. Seline's breath caught. She hadn't expected honesty, and certainly not that. Something in his tone unnerved her, but before she could ask, before she could press deeper, Lucien did something she hadn't anticipated. He reached for her. His fingers barely brushed the inside of her wrist, right over the binding marks that tied her to them all, and for a split second, something flickered across his expression. Something like regret. Then, just as quickly, he pulled away. Seline's heart pounded. Lucien held her gaze for a moment longer before he turned back to the window. "You should be careful," he murmured. voice lower now, almost hesitant. Seline frowned. Lucien didn't answer immediately, but when he did, his words sent a cold ripple of warning down her spine. "Because this palace has more enemies than you know." Seline should have ignored him. She should have turned around and walked the other way. But Cassel had a way of making sure you never wanted to. The golden bronzy Alpha lounged on the edge of the velvet chaise in the study, a book in one hand, a half-smirk playing at his lips. "Come to confess your darkest desires, little queen," he drawled, flipping a page without looking up. Seline crossed her arms. "I'd rather shove a blade between your ribs." Cassel finally looked up, his emerald eyes glittering with something purely wicked. "Ooh," he murmured, his voice a purr of amusement. "I do love when you talk dirty." Seline rolled her eyes. "Why are you here?" she demanded. Cassel tilted his head, studying her like she was an interesting puzzle. "Because," he said lazily, "you're learning the game." Seline stilled. Cassel's smirk deepened. "You think Darius fights you because he wants to break you?" He shook his head, laughing under his breath. "No, sweetheart, he fights you because he knows you'll be powerful once you understand what you are." Seline's fingers twitched. "And what am I?" Cassel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent ice through her veins. "You," he murmured, "are the thing that could destroy us all." The first sign came just before dawn. Seline had returned to her chamber, exhaustion weighing on her limbs when she felt it. The wrongness. Her wolf stirred, ears flattening, hackles raised. She moved slowly, scanning the room. Nothing seemed amiss, and yet her gut whispered of danger. Then she saw it. A single raven feather lying on her pillow. Seline's breath hitched. The meaning was clear, a warning or a promise. Someone wanted her dead, and they had just made their first move. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Night. Some sins were inevitable. Seline wasn't sure when the line had blurred. Was it in the training grounds, where dominance and challenge had bled into something darker, something unspoken? Was it in the nights when she had been watched, when she had felt him near, his presence curling around her like a heat she couldn't shake? Or was it here now, with nothing left to fight, nothing left to deny, nothing but the raw pull of hunger between them? The chamber was small, hidden, a room tucked away within the fortress that none of the others knew about. The air was thick with heat, scented with wax and the faint spice of burning wood from the nearby hearth. Shadows flickered across the stone walls, cast by the golden glow of candlelight. The tension had been building for days. Unspoken, taunting, curling tight between them like a coil ready to snap. And now it had. Now there was no turning back. His presence was a force against her back, heat rolling off him in waves. She hadn't heard him enter, hadn't needed to. She had felt him the moment he stepped inside. Seline turned slowly, breath catching as her eyes met his. Dark, intense, starving. He wasn't watching her like an enemy. He wasn't watching her like a queen. He was watching her like a man who had spent too long resisting something that had already consumed him. And Seline, she wasn't strong enough to resist tonight. She didn't want to be. "I should leave," she whispered, though neither of them moved. His lips tipped into something dark, something knowing. "But you won't." The words were a challenge, a promise. Seline's heart slammed against her ribs. She should turn away, she should walk out. Instead, she took a step closer. His breath hitched, a small, sharp sound that sent something wild, something dangerous, curling through her chest. She wasn't the only one unraveling. The tension between them stretched too tight, and when it finally snapped, it was violence and fire. He reached for her without hesitation, without restraint, his hands firm and possessive, as he dragged her against him. Seline barely had time to suck in a breath before his lips were on hers. Hot, claiming, filled with all the pent-up hunger that had been building for weeks. A low, guttural sound rumbled in his chest, vibrating against her skin as his fingers sank into her waist, pulling her tighter. She gasped, and he took the opportunity, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, deep and consuming. Heat pooled low in her stomach, a slow burn that ignited with every brush of his hands, with every sharp bite of his teeth along her lower lip. Seline pressed harder against him, matching his fire, her nails dragging across his bare skin. A hiss, low and sharp, left him, and then... They weren't just kissing. They were devouring. His lips left her mouth, trailing down the column of her throat, his teeth scraping against her pulse point, making her shudder. "You smell like moonlight," he murmured, voice low and wrecked, as he nipped at her skin, his hands sliding over the thin straps of her gown, pushing them off her shoulders. Celine's breath came quick, shallow, as he undressed her, his touch both reverent and unrelenting. For a moment, just a moment, she hesitated, because this changed everything. This was not power, not war, not survival. This was choice, and she was making it. Seline lifted her chin, her silver eyes burning as she met his gaze. "Don't stop," she whispered. A low growl, full of raw possession, tore from his throat. And then she was lost, lost in his hands, his mouth, his body worshipping hers like he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. He pinned her beneath him, dragging his lips down her stomach, savoring every inch. His hands skated down her thighs, spreading them as he settled between them, his mouth moving lower, lower. Seline arched, gasping his name, the sound breaking on a plea. And God's, the way he reacted to it. His grip tightening, his breathing ragged, his restraint shattering completely. Tonight, she was his, but the truth was, he was hers, too. For weeks, Seline had fought the pull between them, had ignored the way his eyes lingered too long, how his presence was a force she couldn't escape, how every moment alone with him felt like standing on the edge of a blade waiting to fall. She had resisted, denied, pretended she could control this. But tonight, she didn't want control. Tonight, she wanted to feel. The chamber was small, hidden, the air thick with the scent of burning wax on the hearth. Shadows flickered along the stone walls, dancing in the golden glow of candlelight. Seline stood near the door, her breath shallow, her pulse drumming against her skin. She shouldn't be here, she knew that. But neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. She could feel the heat of his gaze, could hear the quiet, measured breaths he took, as if he were trying to restrain himself. He was a predator at the edge of control, and God, she wanted to see him lose it. She wasn't sure who moved first. One second they were standing apart, and the next he was against her, pressing her back against the stone wall, his hands framing her face, his body caging her in. A shuddering breath escaped her lips. Then his mouth crashed into hers. The kiss was fire and fury, raw and consuming. His lips took, demanded, devoured. Seline arched into his hair, pulling, needing more. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, vibrating through her bones, sending a sharp pulse of heat between her thighs. He tore his mouth from hers, his breath heavy, ragged, his forehead resting against hers. "Tell me to stop," he rasped. Celine's nails dug into his shoulders. She should. But instead she whispered, "Don't you dare." A curse, dark and low, left his lips. Then his control snapped. His hands slid down her bare arms, gripping her hips, lifting her against the wall. Her legs wrapped around him instinctively, his body pressing into hers, hard and unyielding. His mouth claimed her throat, his teeth scraping against her pulse. Seline shuddered, her fingers fisting in his shirt, dragging it over his head. The moment skin met skin, the world fell away. His muscles flexed beneath her touch, strong, heated, trembling with restraint. He wasn't just taking her, he was worshipping her. His lips traced fire down her collarbone, over the curve of her breast, his hands sliding lower, gripping her thighs. A gasp escaped her lips as he dragged her down onto the mattress, his weight pinning her beneath him. But it wasn't oppressive. It was safe. It was claiming. Seline's body arched, pressing against him, needing friction, needing more. He let out a sharp inhale, his hands trailing down her stomach, his lips following. Lower, lower. Her breath hitched. His mouth was heat and possession, his tongue slow, deliberate, teasing her, driving her to the edge. Seline's hips bucked, a sharp moan breaking from her throat. His grip tightened, holding her in place. "Stay still," he murmured against her skin. Then he ruined her. Seline shattered, pleasure crashing through her like a wildfire, burning everything else away. And when he finally moved back up, his lips claiming hers once more, his body pressing into hers, she was ready. Ready for him to take her completely. Ready to fall. And when he finally did, when they joined completely, flesh to flesh, breath to breath, it wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, something she couldn't name, something she wasn't ready to accept. The room was silent, except for the slow, steady rhythm of their breathing. Seline lay against his chest, her fingers tracing absent shapes along his skin. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what to feel. He had worshipped her, not just with his hands, but with the way he looked at her, the way he whispered her name, the way he had held her after, as if she was something more, as if this wasn't just about power. Seline closed her eyes, because she couldn't trust that, couldn't trust him, couldn't trust herself. This had changed everything. Or maybe it had changed nothing at all. She had succumbed to temptation. But now she had to decide, had she given him a piece of herself, or had she just found another way to play the game? Chapter 4. The Framing of Seline. Betrayal never comes from your enemies. The air in the Grand Council chamber was thick, with tension, with accusation, with the weight of something Seline couldn't yet name. She had been dragged here at dawn, the echo of her boots against the polished obsidian floor the only sound as the guards forced her forward. But she didn't fight them. She didn't speak, because she knew the moment she saw the faces watching her from the dais, something was very, very wrong. The elders sat in their towering thrones, their lined faces grave. The Alphas stood beside them, Darius, Kieran, Lucien, Cassel, and all of them, every single one, looked at her as if she had already been condemned. Darius was the first to speak. His voice was cold, unyielding, a blade cutting through the silence. "Seline Nightbane," he said, formally, distantly, as if she were nothing more than a criminal brought before him, not his mate, not his equal, not the woman he had touched with fire and possession just nights ago. Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stand tall. "You are accused of orchestrating the attack on the Moon Temple," Darius continued, his golden gaze unwavering. "The sanctuary was burned, the sacred relics stolen, and the warriors left to guard it were slaughtered in the night." Selene's breath caught. The temple. She had not been there, had not even left the stronghold last night. And yet they were looking at her as if she had set the fire herself. She turned to the only one who might still be on her side, Cassel. He leaned against his throne, his emerald green eyes unreadable, his usual smirk absent. But there was something wrong, something off. And then the evidence was laid before her. A single blood-stained dagger, its handle carved with the sigil of the lunar crest pack, her father's crest. Seline's lungs squeezed. "That," she said slowly, forcing control into her voice, "is not mine." But the elders weren't listening. Cassel tilted his head, his voice mild, smooth, full of false curiosity. "No," he mused, "because it was found in the temple ruins, with your scent all over it." Seline's heart pounded, because she knew without a doubt. This was a set-up, and the way Cassel was looking at her, too calm, too detached, too calculated, her stomach sank. He had done this. Cassel, the deceiver, the silver-tongued manipulator, and he was smiling, not in amusement, but in triumph. Seline clenched her fists. "You set me up." Cassel let out a soft chuckle, tilting his head. "Did I?" The words were smooth, easy. Too easy. Seline's pulse thundered. She wanted to scream, to rip the lie from his mouth, to make them see the truth, but the truth didn't matter, not when the accusation was already made, not when Darius had already made up his mind. Her head snapped back to him. He had said nothing, had watched the entire exchange in silence, and somehow that was worse, because Darius was not a man who made decisions lightly, which meant he had already decided. And not in her favor. Seline's voice was calm, but laced with fire when she finally spoke. "You believe them?" she asked, her silver eyes burning into him. "You think I would betray you?" Darius didn't blink, didn't even hesitate. His expression was stone, carved from cold, merciless judgment. "I think," he said, voice like ice, "that your past speaks for itself." Seline staggered back as if he had struck her. The past, the war. Luna Crest had fought against Eclipse Dominion. And now, when they needed a scapegoat, she was the easiest target. A sharp breath shuddered through her. "You were in my bed," she whispered, voice low, fierce, edged with something she couldn't name. "And now you turn on me like this?" A muscle ticked in Darius's jaw. But he didn't waver, didn't even look away. His golden eyes stayed locked onto hers, unyielding, unforgiving. A king, passing his final judgment. "You will be exiled," he said. Seline's breath hitched, her stomach dropped. The words rang through the chamber, sealing her fate. "Take her!" Darius commanded, stepping back, and just like that the guards moved. Chains locked around her wrists, her throat, her ankles. The weight of the silver burned, but not as much as the betrayal, not as much as Darius's voice, cold and final, turning his back on her. And then they dragged her away, out of the palace, out of the life she had begun to carve for herself, out into the wilderness where death was waiting. Betrayal doesn't break you all at once. It's a slow, slicing pain, cut after cut, until nothing remains but raw, open wounds. Seline stood in the center of the great council hall, wrists bound in silver, the weight of chains dragging at her every breath. The elders loomed above, their expressions cold, unreadable, their verdict already decided. The scent of burnt incense clung to the air, mixing with a sharp, metallic tang of blood and deception. Her blood, their deception. And across the chamber, standing beside Darius, Cassel, Lucien, and Kieran, she saw it. Doubt. Judgment. And worst of all, betrayal. Darius's face was a mask of indifference, a king sentencing his prisoner without emotion. Cassel watched with a smirk, but his emerald eyes gleamed with something darker, something victorious. Lucien looked away. And Kieran? His rage was barely contained, his fingers twitching, as if itching for a blade. Seline's stomach twisted. They were really going to do this. They were really going to throw her away. "Seline Nightbane!" one of the elders called, his voice old as the mountains, thick with finality. "You stand accused of treason against the Eclipse Dominion pack." Seline stiffened. "I did nothing." Darius's golden gaze didn't waver. Cassel's smirk deepened. Lucien's jaw tensed. Her eyes locked onto his, desperate for something, anything, that said he believed her. But Lucien did not speak. The man who had warned her, the one who had whispered cryptic truths in the shadows, the one who had touched her wrist with something like regret, he was silent. Seline felt the crack in her chest before she even realized she was holding her breath. No. Lucien's violet gaze flickered, his expression tortured, torn, as if he wanted to step forward, wanted to fight, but something held him back. Something stronger than the truth. Celine's heart pounded. He wanted to believe her, but he wouldn't defy them. Wouldn't defy Darius, and that, more than anything, made her chest burn. The elder continued. "The evidence has been presented. Your dagger, found in the temple ruins." Seline laughed, bitter and sharp. "Planted, you mean? Your scent?" "Stolen," she snapped. The elder's eyes narrowed. Celine's own pulse roared in her ears, her wolf snarling against the silver chains. This was a setup, and yet no one was stopping it. Not Darius, not Lucien, not even Cassel, who she was starting to suspect had orchestrated the entire thing. Then Kieran moved. "Bullshit!" he snarled, his voice a whip crack in the chamber. Celine's breath caught. All eyes turned to the rogue Alpha, his ice-blue gaze burning with fury. "You all know she didn't do this," Kieran growled. "You know damn well this is a setup." Dario's head tilted, unamused. "Enough, Kieran." "No," Kieran shot back. "I'm sick of this." He stepped towards Seline, his hands flexing at his sides, his entire body thrumming with barely contained violence. "She wouldn't do this," he said, voice lower now, edged with something dangerously close to desperation. "She's many things, but she's not a traitor." Celine's throat tightened. He believed her. Kieran was fighting for her. But it wouldn't be enough. She could already see it in the elders' faces, in Darius's unflinching, merciless expression. And then Cassel sighed, shaking his head. "You're letting your cock think for you, Kieran." Kieran whirled on him, fury snapping like a live wire. "I swear to the gods, Draven, I will rip out your—" "Enough!" Darius's command rippled through the air like a thunderclap, his voice filled with dominance, with finality. Kieran bristled, his jaw clenched, his fists shaking, but Seline saw it. The moment he realized he had already lost. The moment he knew nothing he said would matter. Kieran's hands curled into tight fists, and for a moment, just a moment, Seline thought he might fight anyway, might defy Darius, defy the elders, defy them all. But then he exhaled sharply, stepping back, defeated. Seline's heart ached, not for herself, but for him, because for the first time Kieran had fought for someone other than himself, and he had still lost. Darius turned back to Seline. His gaze was steel, his voice was final. "The council has reached its decision." Seline stood her ground, her breath even, her chin lifted, but inside she burned. Inside she screamed. "You're hereby exiled from Eclipse Dominion," Darius declared. "You will be branded as a traitor and cast into the Shadowlands. Should you return, you will be executed on sight." Seline's wolf howled inside her, raging against the invisible chains. This was not just exile. This was a death sentence. Her wrists ached, the silver chains digging into her skin as the guards grabbed her. Her heart pounded as they dragged her toward the ceremonial fire, toward the branding iron waiting in the flames. She had watched this before, had seen the exiles branded on their shoulder, their mark burned into their flesh, forever sealing them as forsaken. But she wasn't ready for the finality of it, wasn't ready for the searing pain as the red-hot iron was pressed to her skin, burning through her nerve endings, marking her for all to see. She clenched her jaw so hard her teeth ached, didn't scream, didn't give them that. And when it was done, when the scent of charred flesh filled the chamber, when the pain throbbed like a second heartbeat, she turned to face the men who had betrayed her. Lucien, whose guilt was painted across his face, Kieran, who still radiated fury, Cassel, who looked entirely too satisfied, and Darius, who had once laid beside her in the dark, who had once touched her like she was something precious, Darius, who had just sentenced her to death. Seline met his gaze, her silver eyes unyielding, and with her next breath she swore she would return, she would make them all regret this, and when she did, she would burn Eclipse Dominion to the ground. Death did not take her. Fire did not break her. And the gods were not done with her yet. The world was a blur of smoke and pain. Seline lay in the dirt, her body broken, her mark of exile still searing into her skin, the scent of burned flesh curling around her like a whispered curse. The Shadowlands stretched around her, a vast and merciless wasteland, a place of forgotten things, of fallen warriors, of those too strong to die but too damned to live. They had cast her here, bound her wrists, scarred her flesh, and left her to rot. But she was still breathing, and that was their first mistake. Pain had become a second heartbeat, a constant presence, a companion. But tonight it was something more. It was a trigger. Seline curled into herself, feeling the weight of the exile brand pressing into her right shoulder, the iron burned deep into her skin. The agony had been unbearable at first, a raw and endless fire, but now something was shifting beneath it, something ancient, something hungry. The ground beneath her trembled, her fingers dug into the soil, into the ancient bones of the land, and for the first time since she had been cast out she felt it, a presence waking inside her, something greater than just her wolf. It was deeper, more, and then the pain vanished. Not faded, vanished. Seline gasped as she looked down at her skin, where the brand should have been, where the wound should have still been raw and festering. But it wasn't. Instead, golden lines of power traced over the scar, shimmering beneath the surface of her flesh, pulsing with the steady rhythm of something ancient and boundless. Her wolf stirred. No, not her wolf. Something more. Seline felt her breath hitch, her body shifting without her command, her skin burning but not with pain. With power. She stumbled forward, gripping onto a broken tree trunk as her vision blurred, as her senses sharpened beyond anything she had ever known. She could hear the heartbeat of the earth beneath her feet, feel the pulse of the wind, taste the raw scent of night on her tongue. And for the first time since she had been cast out, she did not feel powerless. She felt reborn. The Shadowlands were not empty. They were filled with the forsaken, the broken, the warriors left behind, and one by one they came to her. It started with a pair of rogue wolves, their eyes glinting with suspicion as they watched her from the tree line. They had seen her collapse in the dirt, had probably been waiting for her to die. But now, as she stood, glowing with newfound power, her silver eyes burning brighter than before, they hesitated, and Seline knew. They saw it. The shift, the change, the beginning of something greater. She lifted her chin, meeting their wary gazes. "Join me," she said simply, "or stay weak. A test, a challenge." The first robe, a scarred male with sharp golden eyes, snorted, but there was something like respect in his gaze. "What do you think you are, exile?" he asked, his voice rough. Seline smiled. "Not an exile, not any more. A queen," she said, and just like that, they bowed. More came in the following nights. Exiles, outcasts, wolves who had nothing left to lose. They followed not because she asked them to, they followed because they felt what she had become, and they were ready to follow a queen willing to burn the world down. The wind howled through the mountains. Seline stood at the edge of a jagged cliff, looking down at the distant lights of Eclipse Dominion. Her old home. The place that had cast her out, that had branded her a traitor, a criminal, a nothing. And yet they had not broken her, they had created her. Seline flexed her fingers, feeling the pulse of raw power curling beneath her skin, the new presence inside her wolf coiling like a silent storm. The rogues and warriors behind her waited, watching, silent and ready, for her command, for her revenge. She smiled slowly, coldly. "Prepare yourselves," she said, voice smooth as a blade, "because we're going back." And when they did, Eclipse Dominion would fall. Chapter 5. Return of the Alpha Queen. They cast her out, expecting her to break. Instead, she became something they could no longer control. The great hall of Eclipse Dominion was filled with laughter and arrogance, the scent of wine thick in the air. Warriors lounged, nobles whispered, and the elders sat upon their thrones of polished stone, content in their own power. The same council that had condemned her, the same alphas who had turned their backs. They believed her gone, forgotten, nothing more than a dead queen rotting in the Shadowlands. They had no idea. Seline stood outside the great doors, her fingers flexing at her sides, power thrumming through her veins like a second heartbeat. She had not come alone. Behind her, the exiled, the outcast, the forsaken. All wolves who had nothing left but the promise of vengeance. They had gathered under her banner, not as a rebellion, but as a reckoning. And tonight they would witness the fall of the wolves who thought they had won. Seline inhaled deeply, tilting her chin up. Then, with a single effortless push, she shoved open the towering doors. And the world stopped. The room froze. The conversations, the murmurs, the laughter, it all died the moment she stepped into the hall. A hush fell over the court, the weight of 100 stunned gazes crashing into her like a wave. Seline walked forward, unhurried, unrushed. She was not the shattered exile they had cast into the wilderness. She was something else now, something untouchable. Her moon-silver cloak billowed behind her, the heavy fabric embroidered with the sigil of her new pack. Not Eclipse Dominion, not Lunar Crest, but her own. Her silver eyes burned like twin blades, framed by dark cold, her long black hair braided back with woven strands of gold. And her power. God's her power. It crackled in the air, unseen but undeniable, pressing against the room like the first breath of a coming storm. She saw the guards shift nervously, the elders straighten in their seats, the nobles exchanging uncertain glances. They didn't recognize her. Not truly. They had expected an exile, a ruined woman, a lost queen. They had not expected this. Seline let the silence stretch. Let them feel the weight of her presence. Let them wonder. Let them doubt. Then, finally, she smiled, slow and sharp. And the court of Eclipse Dominion trembled. The moment she met Darius' gaze, the temperature in the room shifted. He sat on his throne of obsidian, his golden eyes locked onto her, his body utterly still. No amusement, no mockery, no anger, just pure, unwavering intensity. Seline felt the tension radiating from him, the barely contained storm behind his eyes. She should have looked away, but she didn't. Because now they were equals. Kieran stood beside him, his ice-blue eyes narrowed in disbelief, his usual cocky smirk nowhere to be found. His hands were curled into fists, his body tense, coiled as if he wanted to move but didn't know how. Lucien, silent, haunted Lucien, watched her with something unreadable in his violet gaze, something like guilt, like relief, like something she didn't want to name. And Cassel smiled. Not his usual lazy smirk, not the practiced arrogance, but something slower, sharper, like he had expected her return, like he had wanted it. Seline's rage coiled inside her, but she didn't unleash it, not yet. Instead, she let her gaze sweep over all of them, the alphas who had cast her out, who had abandoned her. "You look surprised," she murmured. Her voice carried through the vast chamber, soft but lethal. Darius's jaw tightened. Seline. Her name from his lips was something dangerous. A demand, a warning, a tether. But she wasn't bound to him anymore. She lifted her chin. "Did you miss me?" Something in Darius snapped. One second he was still, watching her with that unreadable expression. The next, He was moving, faster than she could anticipate, faster than anyone in the room could react. One moment there was space between them, the next he was there, towering over her, his scent wrapping around her like cedar and smoke, his hands gripping the arms of her chair, caging her in. Seline didn't move, didn't flinch, because she refused to yield. Darius' breath was harsh, his body rigid, his golden eyes burning as they searched hers. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, low and lethal. Seline's lips curled. "And yet," she whispered, tilting her head, letting her breath brush against his jaw. "Here I am." A muscle ticked in his jaw. His fingers flexed, as if resisting the urge to touch her, to pull her closer, to claim what he had thrown away. Seline could see it, the hunger, the regret, the dark pull of something he had never fully admitted, and she revelled in it. Because Darius had always thought he owned her, but tonight, as he stood before her, his body rigid with barely restrained desire, his jaw tight, his breath uneven, she owned him. His voice was rough, raw, edged with something dangerous. "You don't know what you've started." Seline smiled. "You have no idea what's coming." Darius exhaled sharply, his fingers twitching at his sides, his control unraveling. But before he could move, before he could break first, Seline stepped past him, leaving him standing there, breathless and wanting, because this time she was in control. And when she took back everything that was hers, Eclipse Dominion would never be the same again. The wolves of Eclipse Dominion thought they had seen the last of her. They thought exile would break her, silence her, erase her from history. They did not expect this. Seline stormed through the great hall, her silver cloak billowing behind her, her boots echoing against the polished obsidian floors. A queen reborn, carved from vengeance and fire. Every eye in the room turned to her, every voice fell silent. She felt the weight of their shock, their fear, their awe, because she was not the broken woman they had cast away. She had returned stronger, deadlier, untouchable, and tonight she was here to take back what was hers. Her gaze swept the room, locking onto the alphas who had once ruled beside her. Darius sat on his throne, still as stone, golden eyes unreadable. Kieran stood beside him, tense, coiled like a wolf ready to fight. Cassel leaned against a marble pillar, his smirk sharp and unreadable. But Lucien's violet eyes burned. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he stepped forward. The court gasped. The room shifted, unsteady, uncertain. Lucien dropped to one knee before her, bowing his head, his fist pressed to his chest. A pledge, a submission, a public, irrevocable declaration of loyalty. Seline's breath hitched. This was not what she expected. Lucien had stood silent when they exiled her. He had not spoken, had not fought. And yet, now here he was, kneeling before her, forsaking his pack, his place for her. A hush fell over the chamber. Then Darius spoke. "Lucien," he said, voice dark, edged with warning. Lucien didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't waver. "I should have fought for you," he said, his voice rough, lined with regret. "I won't make the same mistake twice." Seline's chest tightened. She had no time to respond, because the next moment Kieran stepped forward, and the court trembled. Kieran did not kneel, but he moved to her side, putting himself between her and the other alphas. A silent claim, a stand, a warning. Seline glanced up at him, his ice-green eyes searing into hers. "I told you I'd fight for you," he said lowly, dangerously. His hand flexed at his side, near the hilt of his dagger. "I don't care about their laws, their traditions, their goddamned council. You say the word and I'll burn it all down." Seline's heart thundered, because Kieran had always been reckless, wild, dangerous. But this was different. This was devotion. Not just lust, not just challenge, not just power. This was loyalty, absolute and unshakable. He turned his head, his gaze locking onto Darius, daring him to challenge it. and for the first time Darius did not speak. The tension thickened, the room pulsing with unspoken conflict, a storm ready to break. And then Seline turned to Cassel. His smirk had vanished. His posture was too casual, too forced. Because he knew. Seline stepped closer, her voice ablade. "It was you." Cassel's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered, just for a second. Seline felt the ripple of unrest in the room, the whispers, the shifting weight of suspicion. She had been framed for treason, exiled under false accusations. And now the truth was rising. She let the silence stretch, let them wonder, let them doubt. Then she spoke again, not to Cassel, but to Darius. "Did you ever wonder why the dagger was so easy to find?" Darius's eyes darkened. Seline took another step forward, voice dropping lower, sharper. "Why the scent was fresh, too fresh for someone who had been locked inside your fortress." Kieran's lips curled in a snarl, realization dawning in his gaze. Lucien's fists clenched. "And Cassel?" Cassel finally moved. But it was too late. Seline reached into the folds of her cloak, withdrawing the small golden insignia she had found in the ruins of the Moon Temple. The sigil of eclipsed dominion. The sigil only the Alphas carried. She held it up for all to see. "Tell me, Cassel," she murmured, her voice smooth, cold. "How did this end up in the ashes of the temple you swore you knew nothing about?" The room erupted. Gasps, whispers. Cassel's mask cracked just for a second. But it was enough. Enough for them to see the truth. Enough for them to turn against him. And just like that, the deceiver had fallen. The room was spiraling, the order of power unraveling before their very eyes. Seline turned, facing Darius once more, and this time he did not look at her like an enemy. He looked at her like a man who had lost something he never should have let go, like a king who had underestimated his queen. Seline tilted her head. "What now, Alpha?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Darius, for the first time in his life, had no answer. Fate had tried to control her, but Seline Nightbane had never been one to follow fate. The moon hung high over Eclipse Dominion, casting its silver light over the great hall. The throne room, once a place of power and dominance, was now a battleground of broken alliances, blood-stained floors, and the ghosts of betrayal. Seline stood at the center of it all. A warrior, a queen, a wolf who had forged her own path. Tonight she would end this. Tonight she would choose. The air crackled with tension, thick with the scent of blood and the remnants of battle. Cassel lay at her feet, his once smug face twisted in pain, his emerald eyes no longer gleaming with deception but with fury. He had tried to run, tried to talk his way out of the truth. But Seline had given no mercy. Her blade dripped with his betrayal, the steel reflecting the flickering torchlight. The room was silent. Darius stood rigid, golden eyes locked on her, his expression unreadable. Lucien watched from the shadows, his violet gaze filled with something unspoken, something pained. And Kieran was still at her side, breathing hard, alive, ready. Seline's heart thundered in her chest. The 4 Alphas stood before her. Men she had fought against, fought for, wanted, hated, craved. She had been tied to them all, bound by magic, by war, by passion. But only one of them was hers. Only one of them had been meant for her from the beginning. And yet, fate had never made her choices. She would make this one herself. Her pulse roared in her ears as she turned, meeting each of their gazes one by one. Darius, the tyrant, cold, calculating, powerful. He had cast her out, and now stood before her with regret in his eyes, knowing too late that he had made a mistake. Lucien, the cursed one, haunted, quiet. His love was a silent thing, a constant presence, a sorrow he had never spoken aloud. Kieran, the rogue, fierce, loyal, a wildfire who would burn for her, who had already proven he would stand at her side against gods and fate alike. Her choice was not just about love. It was about who she was, who she had become. Her chest ached, her wolf restless, waiting. And then the bond flared to life, not the forced magic of the harem pact, not the ties Eclipse Dominion had tried to forge in fire and betrayal. This was real. It was a pull so deep, so raw, that her breath caught, her vision blurred, her soul ignited. She turned, heart pounding, and met his eyes. The moment their gazes locked, the bond snapped into place. A rush of power, of rightness, of something that had always been waiting. Seline exhaled sharply, her lips parting, her choice burning through her like fire. His hands were warm, rough, steady, and when he pulled her against him, their bodies flush, their breathing uneven. Everything else disappeared. His lips crashed into hers, no hesitation, no restraint, just pure, raw need. Seline gasped as his hand slid down her back, lifting her effortlessly, pressing her against the cold stone wall as his body burned into hers. This wasn't just desire, it was completion, a claiming neither of them could resist. Her head tipped back as his mouth trailed down her throat, his teeth grazing over the sensitive mark where the mate bond burned beneath her skin. Seline shuddered. His grip tightened. "You are mine," he murmured, voice low, reverent, possessive. Celine's fingers sank into his hair, pulling him closer. "No," she whispered against his lips, her silver eyes burning. "We are each other's." And then, as their bodies joined, as their bond solidified, the bond of true mates not chosen by fate but by will, the world shattered into stars. The past was written in blood, but the future would be forged in fire and choice. The night air was cool against Seline's skin as she stood on the balcony overlooking Eclipse Dominion. The fortress had once felt like a prison, a place of control, of chains, of fate trying to decide her path. Now it was hers. She had not returned as a pawn. She had returned as a sovereign. Below, the courtyard pulsed with life, strength, unity. Warriors trained in formation, the banners of Eclipse Dominion restored but altered. The sigil no longer divided by a claw, but woven with the symbol of the reborn lunar crest. A reminder of what was lost and what had been reclaimed. Peace had settled across the land, but not through submission, through war, through sacrifice, through the unwavering will of a queen who refused to be ruled. And now she ruled them all. The doors to her chamber creaked open, and she felt him before she turned. The mate she had chosen. The man who had stood beside her, bed for her, burned for her. His presence was a steady heat behind her, a force that could not be ignored. "You should be resting," he murmured, his voice low, rough, edged, with something too intimate for a throne room. Seline smiled. "You should know by now, I don't rest easily." She felt his breath warm against her neck before his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against him. "Then let me give you a reason to," he whispered. Celine's pulse fluttered, but she didn't move away. Because this was different. Not a battle of wills. Not a fight for dominance. This was the aftermath. The part of the war no one ever spoke of. The part where you learned how to live again. She turned in his arms, looking up at him, at the fierce devotion in his gaze, at the hunger that would never fade. He was hers, and she was his, not because fate had written it, because she had chosen it. The war had ended, but the stories would never die. They whispered of the exiled queen who had returned in fire and shadow, of the Alphas who had bowed before her, of the love that had been forged in war and sealed in eternity. Some called it a legend, some called it a warning, and some, those who had seen it, who had lived it, called it truth. Because history would remember Seline Nightbane, not as a pawn, not as a mate forced to obey, but as a queen who had bent the world to her will. The shifter's harem was no longer just a tale. It was a legacy, and it had only just begun.